forgotten traditions, hidden rituals, and communities that seem just a little too welcoming. Welcome to Folk Horror 101, where we break down one of horror's most eerie and enduring subgenres. Hey, how you doing? It is I, the Terrorific Lady, otherwise known as Brandy, and welcome to Retro Horror School, and a happy Friday to you. First off, I would like to thank my supporters, the Flat Noodle. Thank you so very much for your support. If you are interested in supporting the channel and getting such perks as joining the private area Discord and viewing all videos one day early, then go to ko-fi.com/terrorificlady or twitch.tv/terrorificlady. So here we go. It is spring, and spring is the perfect time to go outside, listen to the birds chirping, and also watch some folk horror. I figured that for Retro Horror School, in honor of spring, I would teach you about folk horror. So, a little folk horror 101. We're going to go over a brief history of folk horror, some characteristics of folk horror, and some examples of folk horror films. Before we get started, I would really like to know what your favorite folk horror film is. Let me know in the comments. The term folk horror was coined in the early 2000s, and there isn't even really one moment that you could pinpoint to where you're like, oh, this is exactly the very first time it was used. But it was widely recognized when Mark Gatiss used it in 2010 in the BBC documentary A History of Horror. So even though the term itself is really not that old, the concept of folk horror dates back much earlier. Early folk horror, as we know it, seems to have started in Britain when, on the same documentary, Gatiss and Jonathan Rigby mentioned that folk horror started with what is called the unholy trinity of horror. Witchfinder General, which came out in 1968, The Blood on Satan's Claw, which came out in 1971, and The Wicker Man, which came out in 1973. By looking at these three movies, people tend to equate folk horror with movies that came out maybe in the late 60s, early 70s that have a very rural kind of earthy association to them and that deal with paganism and witchcraft. But defining folk horror only through British folk horror is a little too limited of a definition. Folk horror is a global phenomenon shaped by different cultures and their own unique myths, stories, and fears. So what actually makes a film a folk horror film? Well, much like Giallo, a folk horror film doesn't have a checklist of characteristics, but what I like to do in that case is look at commonalities among folk horror films, and here's what I found. First off, the landscape and setting. Many folk horror films are set in rural areas, forests, villages, or isolated farmlands, to where the setting itself can almost seem like a character, which I'm always really big on. But not all folk horror has to be set in very rural, out-of-the-way areas. It's not limited to just that. Movies like Candyman 1992 and Rosemary's Baby, which came out in 1968, shows that urban folk horror can exist as long as the fear stems from hidden, lingering traditions buried beneath modern society. Next up, isolation and very questionable moral beliefs. A key theme in folk horror is isolation, not necessarily being physically alone, but feeling like the outsider in a group that has very weird beliefs. Take Sergeant Howie in The Wicker Man, which came out in 1973. He isn't alone per se, but he's surrounded by people with very strange, questionable beliefs that are very out there to him, that he does not understand. This also ties folk horror to backwoods horror, films like Deliverance, which came out in 1972, and The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which came out in 1974, where outsiders find themselves trapped in these formed societies where the people there live by their own rules, their own terrifying rules. Beliefs and rituals over monsters. Unlike supernatural horror, which focuses on entities like ghosts, demons, or monsters, folk horror is more often concerned with human beliefs and human actions. Even when supernatural elements exist in a movie, the real horror comes from the people who invoke them. Movies like The Blood on Satan's Claw show how paranoia and belief can lead to dark and disturbing outcomes. Now, let's take a look at some examples that capture the essence of the folk horror genre. The Wicker Man, which I mentioned a few times already, it's a folk horror classic about an isolated island community. I think it's called Summer's Isle, and their chilling traditions. The Witch, which came out in 2015, that is a folk horror film with a slow burn that explores religious paranoia and isolation in 1600s New England. Midsommar, which is directed by Ari Aster and came out in 2019, is a very modern take on folk horror set in a seemingly peaceful but murderous Swedish village. Apostle, which came out in 2018, is a very brutal story of a man infiltrating a religious cult on a remote island. Kuroneko is a bit of an older example past the eras that I like to talk about. It came out in 1968, but it is a Japanese folk horror film that blends supernatural revenge with folklore. Even though it has supernatural elements, it is tied to folk horror, and the supernatural elements that happen are a result of people's actions. November, which came out in 2017, is an Estonian folk horror film that is filled with black and white dreamlike visuals and has all sorts of eerie folklore in it. And last but not least, The Blair Witch Project, which came out in 1999, is considered a folk horror film, a found footage folk horror film, but a folk horror film nonetheless, that uses documentary-style storytelling to explore an urban legend, the fear of the unknown, and the dangers of the deep woods. Folk horror taps into something primal, our fear of the unknown, of isolation, and of traditions that we don't understand. Folk horror reminds us that sometimes the scariest thing isn't the supernatural or the ghosts, it's the people and how far they're willing to go in the name of their beliefs. Thank you so much for watching Folk Horror 101. What other characteristics do you tend to notice in folk horror films? Let me know in the comments below. Please like and share this video with fellow horror fans. It really does help. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another Retro Horror School class. I'm going to toss up some videos here that I think you might like, and sadly, the class is dismissed, everybody, for now, but I will see you next time. Bye!